It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, newsbreakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
The arrest of farm workers by federal agents at Vermont's largest dairy operation in April has sparked fears of more enforcement efforts targeting migrant workers by the Trump administration. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Bakery, I spoke with Will Lambeck of the advocacy group Migrant Justice. Vermont produces 63% of the milk supply in New England, and there are roughly 800 undocumented people working at the state's 439 dairy farms. We'll kick off our discussion right after this. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. Let's begin with the history here of migrant justice. You began back in 2009. Why?
Sure, yeah. So Migrant Justice was founded following a tragedy. A 19-year-old dairy worker from Chiapas, Mexico, named Jose Obet Santis Cruz, was killed in a preventable workplace accident working on a dairy farm in Franklin County. And his death really revealed the presence of this community of hundreds of immigrants living and working on dairy farms and sustaining the Vermont's most important industry in a way that was really hidden from view, that was invisibilized. And at the same time, his death was a spark for that community to start to come together, to organize, and say, no, nobody else should be going home in a body bag. So workers began to come together in regional assemblies, talk about common problems, envision collective solutions, and out of that process built the organization Migrant Justice.
What does organizing mean in this context?
Organizing means breaking down the isolation that workers are experiencing, coming together, and in those assemblies, workers realized, the things that are happening to me on my farm are also happening down the road on the other farm. We're having these common experiences, and then by talking about them together, workers are able to understand the root causes. Why are we experiencing these things? What's at the root of these abuses of our rights? And then let's come together to develop strategies that can solve those. So sometimes that means trying to change the laws and policies in the state. For example, we're all living in isolation. We're all feeling like prisoners on our farms. We can't go to the grocery store. We can't take our kids to the park. Let's change the law in Vermont to expand access to driver's licenses to any state resident, regardless of immigration status. And workers organized in 2012, 2013. For the first time in history, probably, people are going to the halls of the State House and speaking in Spanish, giving testimony, and we're able to be successful in changing the law. And then sometimes that organizing means not changing laws and policies, but changing corporate practices. And that is what workers have done with the creation of the Milk with Dignity program.
What do you mean by root causes?
Well, the idea of looking at root causes, and this is something, really essential to the theory of community organizing and other models of social change, is looking beyond just the symptoms to what is what's at the base. Before Migrant Justice, there were different initiatives in the state of well-meaning folks thinking about, there's this new community of immigrant farm workers. They're having a tough go of things. How do we try to create supports and services to address those community needs? And so with the example of lack of access to transportation, you had folks saying, all right, well, if people can't go grocery shopping, let's bring them food to their farms. That's a service approach. And what made Migrant Justice different is the organization created a space for workers to talk amongst themselves, to create an organization not just for farm workers, but by farm workers. And by getting to the root causes, you aren't just saying, here's this symptom, let's put a Band-Aid on it, but going deeper and saying, what would we need to change in the structures and institutions and laws of the state in order to prevent this problem from happening in the first place. And in this instance, that was access to driver's licenses.
Why are the jobs on farms not being filled by Vermonters? Why is there a need for people from the outside?
That's a really good question. There's
probably the first time you've ever been asked.
Yeah. I mean, there's I think a sort of like surface level response to that you hear a lot in this state, that sort of gets put forward as common sense, that just, Americans don't want to work anymore, and these Mexican guys have a great work ethic. And that's not invented out of whole cloth. I mean, there is some truth there, but the actual answer is much more complex. And doesn't rely on those sort of ethnic stereotypes that, even if it seems like it's a positive representation, it doesn't really benefit the community in the way that folks think it does. So the actual answer has to do with the change in the dairy industry over the past 50 years, or even longer. In 1950, there were over 10,000 dairy farms in the state. Yeah. The average herd size was a couple dozen. And so most of the work in the dairy industry was being done by the owner-operators of the farm, the farmer and their family. That's the classic model. Right now, there are just about 400 farms in the state.
Wow.
So there's this huge decrease in farms, thousands of farms going under. But at the same time, the number of cows and the volume production of milk in the state has increased consistently. So what's happened? There's been this massive industry consolidation. Smaller farms go under, and in order to survive, their neighbors buy up their herds, buy up their land, and grow. And now you have farms with hundreds, or even in a few cases in Vermont, thousands of cows. And so in the past couple of decades, there has been the creation of a labor force that didn't previously exist. Before, it was the farm owners and their families providing the vast majority of the labor, and now the vast majority of the labor in the dairy industry is done by waged workers, by hired workers. And so it's less about the displacement of U.S.-born workers by immigrant workers, and more about the creation of a demand for a labor supply that didn't exist in Vermont before, and that demand has been filled by immigrant workers.
And is it largely Mexican?
In Vermont, it is. Yeah, most workers are coming from Mexico, and a couple, small sending communities in the southern Mexican states of Tabasco and Chiapas. Most workers in the state are coming from rural communities themselves. Now we're seeing really, the second, and in some cases, I think the third generation of workers coming over from small towns like Las Margaritas, Chiapas, and Comitán, and people whose parents were working on the dairy industry. Now they've grown up and they've come, and grandkids. So there's a quite intimate relationship between Vermont dairy farms and these sending communities from southern rural Mexico.
That's a hell of a long way to go to get a job.
It sure is. It's a long way, and it's an arduous journey for people. People oftentimes, almost always, have to go fairly deep into debt, but they're making the smart economic calculus that if you can get here, you can save up enough money to pay off your debt and send money back to your family, and that is why people are here by and large. They are putting their kids through school. They are buying medicine for aging parents. They're buying a house, or they're building a house so that their family is able to move out of their parents' home and start a life of their own. That's by and large what's bringing folks to Vermont. They have to sacrifice a lot to get it done. It's been something that has benefited people.
How would you describe working conditions today, say, compared to 2009, and also the relations between worker and farmer?
Yeah. So when you look at working conditions in Vermont's dairy industry, we sort of see a tale of two farms. There are farms that are in the Milk with Dignity program, and where workers benefit from the protections of that program. And then there are farms that are outside the program. For farms that don't have the protections of Milk with Dignity, working conditions can oftentimes be fairly grim. Migrant Justice conducted a survey last year with over 200 dairy workers in Vermont who are working outside of the Milk with Dignity program. Of those workers, 87% are making below the state minimum wage. The average wage is $2 an hour below the state minimum. More than half of workers are working 12 or more hours a day. Oftentimes, those are straight shifts without time for meals or breaks. A quarter of workers are working 7 days a week without a day off ever. Things like vacation and sick leave and holiday pay are exceedingly rare in the industry. Of course, nobody gets overtime. Most workers are living in housing that's provided by their employer. These are oftentimes, old leaky trailers that are overcrowded, or what are euphemistically called barn apartments. Basically the farmer will put up some plywood walls on the side of the garage, or have workers sleeping, literally right above the cows in the milking parlor. Pest infestations, lack of insulation and heating and potable water, sometimes just, really atrocious and inhumane conditions. Health and safety issues are huge. Astronomical rates of workplace-related injuries from exposure to dangerous chemicals, injured by heavy machinery, or getting kicked or trampled by the cows themselves. And then things like discrimination, sexual harassment, child labor, and even violence from employers.
Okay, here's the first of what will be several dumb questions. So where are the usual protections, OSHA, VOSHA, the Labor Department? Yeah. I mean, you just described a laundry list of things that somebody would say are just outrageous.
Yeah. There are two issues with labor protections for farm workers. One is that the law exempts agricultural workers from many labor protections that others take for granted. And two, even the laws that are on the books rarely go enforced. So a couple of those statistics I mentioned, paid below minimum wage, no overtime pay, those we might think are immoral conditions, but they aren't illegal. In Vermont, farm owners don't have to pay the state minimum wage to workers. And on small farms, they don't even have to pay the federal minimum wage. The exemptions from labor laws have a huge impact on the poor conditions and pay for workers. And then even the laws that are on the books rarely go enforced. So you asked about OSHA and VOSHA. Congress prohibits OSHA from inspecting farms with fewer than 11 employees. So the small farm exemption means that the vast majority of dairy workers have never had an OSHA inspection. Workers can get maimed or even killed on dairy farms, like what happened with Jose Obeth, and OSHA and VOSHA are prohibited from investigating the conditions that led to those injuries or workplace deaths. And then we see other things like the housing situation. Farm owners who are providing housing have more or less the same requirements as any other landlord in the state, but no state agency is inspecting these houses to make sure that they're up to code. There's no responsive complaint system that workers have access to, so poor conditions rarely go addressed.
I know there are some workers here who are under a special visa program, but largely we're talking about, I think the term is undocumented immigrants. What does that even mean?
That's right. So the vast majority of workers in Vermont's dairy industry, like the vast majority of farm workers around the country, are undocumented, meaning they either came into the country without authorization, or they came in on some sort of temporary work visa and then overstayed that visa to continue living and working in the United States. And the U.S. economy is reliant on this workforce of millions upon millions of undocumented workers that really lays bare the central hypocrisy of the U.S. immigration system. We have a keep out sign at the border and then a help wanted sign right under it. Everybody understands that this country is reliant on the labor of undocumented people, but there's not a way. There's no pathway for people to get authorization, to get a visa, to come live and work in the United States for these types of jobs. You mentioned the temporary work visas that some agricultural operations have access to. Those are known as H-2A visas, and that allows, for example, in Vermont, we see a lot of apple orchards employ immigrant workers seasonally, and in Vermont, mostly coming from Jamaica. The dairy industry doesn't have access to those sorts of visas because they're year-round operations. And we actually, don't see that as the solution. Again, some folks on Capitol Hill and in the industry would say, all right, if only we could expand H-2A to dairy, problem solved. The problem with that, though, is that when you tie somebody's employment status to their immigration status, you create a real breeding ground for labor abuse and exploitation. If a worker knows, if I speak up and get fired, then not only am I out of a job, but I'm out of the country, that means that workers are less likely to speak up, to defend their rights, and to make complaints about abuses. And we've seen that around the country. Workers on these temporary agricultural visas living in literal slave conditions, people who are forced to work, who are held in bondage, and there have been these massive uncoverings and investigations of these absolutely atrocious conditions. Now those haven't been in Vermont, but that's not a pathway that we would look to expand. What's really needed is just a sane immigration system that says we have a large community of people who are living and working in Vermont, who are an essential part of the community, an essential part of the economy. Just let them live here under the protections of the law, give them permanent protections to make a life here and not fear detention or deportation.
I've been living in Vermont long enough to know we were a big milk producer, but 63% of New England's milk comes from Vermont. Has that always been? Is that a stable number?
Yeah, I won't speak off the cuff about the statistics, but in general, yes. Vermont has been the major milk producer in New England historically. In the country, we're still relatively small fry. When you compare Vermont to Texas, to California, to Wisconsin, and there you have farms that are tens of thousands of cows, and in Vermont, you just, with the landscape, we wouldn't be able to achieve that scale. So that puts quite a lot of pressure on Vermont farmers. They're competing against these massive operations out west, where the feed is cheaper, where the land is cheaper. In the Northeast, Vermont is a huge player, biggest producer by far in New England, and then when you look at states' reliance on a single industry, Vermont is far and away the most reliant on a single agricultural industry. So not only is Vermont important for dairy in the Northeast, but dairy is incredibly important for Vermont.
Go back here. You mentioned the hypocrisy of how this whole system is working and that we depend on this labor and we just sort of don't acknowledge the reality. Was the stability of people that were working here not threatened until recently, or is this has changed radically in the past couple of months, right, or not?
Yes and no. There have been significant changes, and we'll talk about those. But the underlying baseline of the threats of immigration, detention, and deportation have been something that the community has lived with for decades. Vermont is a border state, meaning that we have two agencies, ICE and Border Patrol, or U.S. Customs and Border Protection in the state. It's a 95% white state, meaning that Mexican immigrants and people of color in general, are highly visible, and racial profiling and discrimination is something that people are very susceptible to. And workers are living in rural areas, oftentimes right up alongside the border. It has been the case for a long time that the threat of being pulled over by Border Patrol or having ICE track you down is a threat that workers and their families have lived with for a long time. And when Democrats are in the White House, that threat remains. When Republicans are in the White House, that threat remains. Now, at the same time, the threat is increasing significantly. So we're seeing many more people being detained and put in deportation proceedings and ultimately deported and separated from their families and their ability to make a living in the past couple months.
Living under the threat can be quite stressful, to say the least. But were people being deported all the time and we just didn't hear about it in the media because it wasn't as high profile?
Yeah, they were. Not at the rate that they are now, but under both the Obama and Biden administrations, Vermont farm workers were being detained and deported by ICE and Border Patrol.
Arbitrarily?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of most classic fact pattern that we see is, somebody driving along Route 105 in Enosburg, Border Patrol pulls them over for some pretext, and you read these affidavits from Border Patrol, and they're saying, the operator was, driving in a way that led me to believe that he was undocumented, that sort of thing. I'm paraphrasing, of course.
Driving while undocumented.
Yeah,
that's an interesting
exactly.
charge.
Yeah. So I mean, it's clear pretext for racial profiling. Border Patrol sees a car of farm workers, they pull them over, and then they engage in what are called, in the sort of Orwellian language, consensual encounters. They'll say, I engaged the occupants of the vehicle, and in the course of the discussion, they divulged to me that they were in the country without authorization. What that looks like in practice, of course, is Border Patrol threatening people, putting the screws on them until they give up the information that then would allow Border Patrol to detain them and put them in removal proceedings.
And were they generally being removed?
Generally, yes. Depending on the policies of the administration, there have been ways where migrant justice could strategically intervene, and those points of intervention are really being narrowed right now. So there have been, many cases of people who have been detained, and where through public advocacy and organizing, migrant justice has been able to get people released on bond and then ultimately have their deportation cases dropped. That hasn't always been the case. There have been successful interventions, and we're still doing that. And in the past couple of weeks, we've won the release of 3 farm workers from detention who have been recently detained. But the sort of political pathways and legal pathways are becoming more and more difficult to do that.
Where's the political leadership / establishment on this? I mean, Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Peter Welch, the governor, where have they been on this?
Yeah, and it depends a little bit from person to person in there. There are differences. We saw, though, after the large...
not to interrupt you, but I mean, given that we are producing 63% of the milk, I mean, that's the reality.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we saw after the April detention of 8 farm workers on a farm in Franklin County that Vermont's political class pretty, roundly criticized that enforcement action from Border Patrol, spoke out against those arrests. What we see, though, is that oftentimes the direction of the solidarity is going more at the industry than the individuals, and you see this playing out in news stories as well, where people's concern is really is the milk going to keep flowing rather than for the human beings who are being caged and separated from their families and traumatized and deported. So it's a positive step when political leaders speak out against arrests of immigrants, but at the same time, the content of the statement is important too, and what it represents in terms of what people are actually valuing.
That must be maddening to somebody like you.
Oh, of course it's maddening. Yeah, I mean, but it's not new. I think, the most egregious thing we saw is a local TV reporting in April after these arrests happened, where the headline was, local farm family shook after 8 of their workers are detained.
Right.
And it's, so clear from a media studies perspective, like the framing of that who's the protagonist and who's being othered in that story. And I think, for all of the sort of progressive backpatting that Vermont does, and the reputation that the state has, I think we still have a long way to go as a state to really see the humanity of our immigrant neighbors.
Well, and I'll plead guilty too. I wouldn't be talking to you here today were it not for that case up in Franklin County.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's fine. I mean, these spectacular situations are what's required, really, to get people to see the problem for what it is, and then the question then is how does the state react, right? Is it just to sort of like try to protect the dairy industry, or is it to say, as a state, we are going to show up for immigrant neighbors, we're going to do whatever we can to protect people from these abuses and attacks?
What's been the reaction within the farm worker community?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of fear right now, obviously. I mean, people are so shooken. It's a relatively small community, so most people have a cousin or a brother or somebody who's gone through this, or somebody from their hometown in Mexico. So word travels fast anytime there's an arrest, and people really feel that very deeply and feel it very personally. And so there is a sense of fear of, could I be next? But at the same time, by and large, what we're hearing from the community is a sense of resilience and resistance. I mean, particularly for people who have been here for years, they lived through and survived the first Trump administration, and there's a sense that we're going to survive this too. Yes, we know that more deportations are coming, and that's a tremendous threat, but the community is going to persist. And then there's a sense of resistance as well. I mean, through the past 15 years of organizing, immigrants in Vermont have won tremendous things, have really changed the conditions of their lives and the life of their community in the state, in access to driver's licenses, policies against police discrimination, improved conditions on farms in the Milk with Dignity program. More recently, winning access to higher education. Last year, Migrant Justice passed a law in the state allowing any Vermont resident, regardless of immigration status, to study at a state college or university with in-state tuition, get financial aid. So, this is the sort of thing that nobody would have thought about 20 years ago, but now the community has set down the roots, it has the stability where they can think about, the education and what could happen with the next generation. So people have really won this sense of stability, which didn't exist decades ago, and there's a sense of we're not going to go back in the shadows. We're not going to give up the protections that we've won, and Vermont is people's second home, and they aren't going anywhere fast.
Everybody, as you know, is due process, but in reality, do you have a chance if you challenge your deportation?
I mean, the short answer is oftentimes yes, sometimes no. It depends a bit on the circumstances of the case. One thing that we're seeing right now under the Trump administration is the expanded use of this authority called expedited removal. In most instances, when somebody is apprehended in the country and ICE is alleging that they don't have lawful status, there's a removal proceeding. They go in front of an immigration judge, the judge makes a determination and can order a deportation. ICE has this parallel process, which typically has just been used when they're apprehending somebody in the process of entering the country. That's called expedited removal. So, the idea is, if we saw the person crossing without authorization, we aren't going to go through the whole rigmarole of court proceedings. We don't have to prove that they weren't in the country with status. And there have always been problems and abuses with the way that expedited removal has been implemented, but now we're seeing this massive expansion of the Trump administration essentially using expedited removal for anybody who can't prove 2 years of continuous presence in the United States. So in those instances, the due process that people have previously been afforded of court hearings and the ability to show why they shouldn't be removed is really going out the window.
What status do you gain by being here 2 years?
It's just then there's no legal status to it, but then the attorneys for ICE can't pursue expedited removal against you at that point.
One of the things that just is so striking about this, it's one thing to be deported, but some of these cases where people are held for, 42 days before really anything happens, call me naive, but I'd rather have the process move along instead of being held in some detention facility kind of in limbo.
Yeah. Yeah, and many people do. Many people, when they're detained, they just think, all right, well, that bad luck. I made it as far as I could, and now it's time to go. And so that's one of the reasons why Vermonters aren't hearing about most of the detentions that are happening, because the pressure on somebody in detention is so great to just accept their fate, and what's being presented to them by the ICE agents is. You could try to fight it, but you're going to get deported anyway. So best just to sign for your release, and we'll get you out of here quick. Sometimes that still means that they're held in detention for weeks at a time. For others, especially when they have family here and then they've built a life here, that's not an option. And especially for people who, in addition to the economic reasons for migrating, are also fleeing violence and persecution in their countries. The idea of just giving up and going back to their country of origin really isn't an option, and that's why some people make the decision of fighting their case, trying to win release on bond, trying to win immigration relief, and are sometimes successful in doing that.
Like how successful?
In our context, in this recent series of arrests in April, there were these 9 people who were in detention, 8 from this arrest on one farm, and then one who was arrested previously on his way to that farm.
Right.
3 have been released and are back in Vermont. 4 have been deported, and 2 are still in detention.
Where do you see this going?
Well, it's tough to say. Trump came into office, promising mass deportation on a scale nobody's seen. He talked about deporting 20 million people, and I think the sort of common wisdom with Trump watchers is you take him seriously, but not literally. We don't need to believe everything he said, and some of the things are clearly exaggerations, and there's just not it's not realistic. But what we know is that immigration arrests are increasing. They're going to continue to increase. The more money that Congress gives Trump to hire more agents and build more prisons, the faster that he'll be able to achieve this policy of mass deportation. So we know where things are headed, and it's going to be a really difficult time. What Vermont can do is, at the very least, ensure that our state resources and our state agencies aren't being used in the service of that federal policy of mass deportation. And so that's why the work that Migrant Justice has done over the years around Vermont's fair and impartial policing policies, the work that we've done to ensure that DMV records, for example, aren't being used by ICE to identify and detain people, is incredibly important. Historically and around the country, police and jails have been used as force multipliers by ICE to find and surveil and detain people on a mass scale. And so far in Vermont, that has largely not been the case.
So state police don't get involved, Richford police don't get involved, Franklin County sheriffs don't get involved?
Generally, that's correct. Every department in the state of Vermont has a policy on the books that says your job is not immigration enforcement. You shouldn't be in the business of deportations. However, there are some loopholes and carve-outs in that policy. And so we do occasionally see instances where police are turning people over to federal deportation agents, and sometimes that's being done in violation of the policy, and we have to, hold officers and agencies accountable to that. And we also have to work to try to shore up those loopholes and try to make sure that the policy is as protective and as expansive as possible. But in comparison to other states where the policies are really moving the other direction, where state legislatures and governors are doing their best to ensure collaboration with between local law enforcement and federal immigration agencies, Vermont is really on the other end of that spectrum.
I should have asked you this earlier. Are most of the farm workers coming through Canada? Are they coming south from Mexico through the entire United States up to here? What's the path?
Yeah, most come over the southern border and come then travel through the U.S. to come to Vermont. The routes that people take sort of change over time and depends on a range of different policies. So sometimes more people have come into Vermont through Canada. Generally, most people are coming across the border from Mexico to the U.S.
This just seems as though the work you're doing, you're just going against this gradient that is not in your favor. And I know I asked you this before, but are you getting? Is there more that the political sector could be doing? Are you satisfied with what they're doing, or are they just sort of paying lip service? Are they doing the same thing the media is doing, that their focus is really on the dairy industry as opposed to the people? That's like a five-part question. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I'll come back to sort of what the political class can do. But to the first part, it certainly feels like an uphill battle sometimes, and right now it's a very difficult landscape for immigrant communities and immigrant-led organizations in Vermont and around the country. But we've also been here before. At the tail end of the Obama administration and at the start of the Trump administration, the ICE office in Vermont began to really explicitly target migrant justice as an organization and engaged in a multi-year campaign of retaliation against migrant justice and its leadership. Dozens of members were arrested, and some of the most high-profile leadership were detained and put in removal proceedings. ICE was surveilling the organization, recruiting informants and sending them into meetings, real full-scale press to try to destroy migrant justice and the ability of the community to organize. And those were really dark times. It was very difficult. People were extremely scared, and they overcame that fear to continue to, come out in marches and rallies to stand up against these arrests. And we ultimately ended up suing the federal government and saying that what ICE was doing was a First Amendment violation. They were violating people's right to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and that all residents in the country, regardless of immigration status, have the protections of the First Amendment. And we were ultimately successful in that with the mix of public campaigning and litigation. ICE dropped the deportation cases against the plaintiffs. They actually paid compensation to migrant justice leaders, and they put a policy in practice that prohibits them from targeting people based on their First Amendment protected speech and activities. So the immigrant community in Vermont has shown before that it's capable of standing up to the Trump administration and coming out on top. The challenges under this administration are different and they're new, but people are not giving up, and they're continuing to fight for their rights as they should. With Vermont elected officials and political leaders, people certainly welcome the statements of political officials speaking out about immigration detentions and deportations, but where words are not enough. The state has much more to do to really take care of and protect immigrants in the state. And one of those issues is playing out in the State House as we speak. Migrant Justice has been behind a proposal to expand access to housing for immigrant families in the state. One of the reasons why most dairy workers live in employer-provided housing is because if they tried to rent housing in the rental market, the first thing that landlords ask them for is a social security number, which if you don't have it, it means your application's put in the trash and you're never going to get access to housing that's not tied to your employment. So this proposal would prohibit discrimination based on citizenship or immigration status in Vermont's Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act, and it would also prevent landlords from requiring a social security number in the rental application process. So it's been moving forward, and there has been a lot of support from it from elected officials. It's passed out of the Senate and House with different versions, and so literally as we speak right now, there's a committee of conference that's going over the two versions, and there's been a lot of opposition to it. A lot of landlords are saying, the state can't force me to rent to an illegal, and there are a lot of landlords who are in the legislature. So all the terrible stuff has come out in this process. People really demonstrating their prejudice, and it's been tough to see. It's been tough to hear, people just saying, no, I shouldn't be forced to rent to somebody like that. The kind of thing you might.
Yeah, the phrase "somebody like that." Yeah. We've heard that one before in American history.
Yeah, it's been a tough political fight. I'm very hopeful that we're going to have new protections put in place this legislative session, and that'll be a real boon to the state and immigrants living in Vermont.
Where's the governor on that?
He hasn't taken a position yet, so we'll see what happens.
You just said that the problems today are different, new and different, but it doesn't sound like it. So what did you mean by that?
What we're seeing is from the perspective of immigration enforcement, an escalation and the implementation of new policies which make it more difficult to fight back. But it's more an escalation than the creation of something new.
And are you just bracing for more of this to come?
We don't know. Yeah, it's certainly about preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. Migrant Justice has invested a lot into education within the community about what people's rights are in encounters with immigration officials and how to be mitigating risk. But there's no magic bullet. There's no way to keep yourself wholly safe in those encounters. And we can talk about what people's rights are, and then if the administration decides that they want to ignore what the legal requirements are around probable cause and that sort of thing, they're going to do it, and then it'll there will be court cases, and we can try to shore up the protections that people have, but it's a difficult time for sure. But what I would say is that the immigrant community in Vermont is much better positioned right now to encounter these challenges than in other states.
What did I not ask you? I should have.
Come back a bit to the Milk with Dignity program, which I mentioned before. But this has been something really incredible that immigrant dairy workers in Vermont have created and implemented. In the early years of migrant justice, the strategy around the types of workplace abuses that I was mentioning was, all right, workers are going to organize on their farm. They're going to try to talk with the farmer, win improvements, and sometimes that was successful, but it was like putting out fires, and workers would win a higher wage or would get housing fixed up, but then the next year those things would revert back, or the housing would break down again, and they would have to do it all over again. So eventually, farm workers in Vermont said, it's not enough just to be organizing farm by farm. We need to create really systemic change in the industry, and began to look around at what models were out there where workers had been able to create that real transformational change, and came upon a group of tomato pickers from South Central Florida called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or the CIW. And what the CIW had done was develop this analysis called worker-driven social responsibility. And the idea of that is the site of power in an industry, whether it's the tomato industry in Florida or the dairy industry in Vermont, isn't at the site of the employment relationship. The fight isn't between the worker and the employer. The fight is with the corporation at the top of the supply chain. When workers began to analyze the dairy industry and look at the trends over the past couple of decades, I mean, what they were seeing is this process of corporate control was pushing down dairy prices, which created a downward pressure on wages and working conditions, and that farmers and farm workers actually have a lot of shared interests in this deeply unfair system of corporate supply chains, and that all the profits in the industry were flowing to the companies at the top, and that both workers and farm owners were losing out. So adapting the lessons from the Coalition of Immokalee workers, and it was great, dairy workers going down to Florida, meeting with tomato workers, learning about how they had been successful in the creation of the Fair Food Program, bringing those lessons back to Vermont. Over the course of a couple of years, developed the Milk with Dignity program, launched a campaign inviting Ben & Jerry's to join. Ben & Jerry's, of course, has made a national brand for themselves and this progressive image, but they had never looked internally at what are the conditions on the farms producing the cream in Ben & Jerry's ice cream. It took a couple years for them to come around and a lot of public pressure, but eventually they did and signed the first Milk with Dignity agreement. And that means for dozens of farms and hundreds of farm workers in Vermont and also a few in New York State, workers are on farms enrolled in the Milk with Dignity program. And so farm owners who are in Ben & Jerry's supply chain are getting a premium on the milk, and then they're using that money to invest in wages and working conditions for their employees. So farms are required to abide by a code of conduct that workers themselves have created that codifies their definition of dignified and respectful treatment and includes standards for wages, hours, benefits, health and safety, housing, protections against sexual harassment and discrimination and retaliation. And for the hundreds of workers who are in this program, I mean, the changes are really, it's night and day. The conditions are so different from those that are outside the program, and workers have really won something tremendous. But it's about 20% of Vermont's dairy industry is enrolled in the program, which is a great start, but that still means the majority of farm workers do not count on those protections, and that's why it's so important to expand the Milk with Dignity program and bring it to more farms, and that requires more companies following Ben & Jerry's footsteps and joining the program. And for the last couple of years, the focus has been on Hannaford Supermarket, which is the largest supermarket chain in northern New England, one of the largest buyers of dairy in the region, and farm workers are calling on Hannaford to source their milk from Milk with Dignity.
So is that the opportunity here? I mean, as you know, out of bad situations, whether it's a medical diagnosis, whatever, you have these opportunities. I mean, this is a crisis situation here. Is that the opportunity that you grab?
Yeah, I mean...
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah,
okay.
No, I think so. Yeah, I mean, certainly the issues are linked. They're in times of increasing attacks against immigrants. I mean, that creates a situation for more exploitation and labor abuse. And at the end of the day, when you analyze it, that's the point of all of this. The Trump administration isn't interested in getting rid of every immigrant because they know that the economy runs on immigrant labor. I mean, Trump's businesses, for Christ's sake, run on immigrant labor. So, more than expulsion, these policies are really about maintaining this underclass of workers who can be exploited because of the precarity and the lack of rights that they're experiencing. And so that's why, Milk with Dignity program is more important than ever in a period of attacks against immigrant workers. People need to be supporting these worker-led initiatives to protect immigrant workers' rights.
So you, if you're Trump, you get rid of just enough immigrants to satisfy your base, but not too many to undermine the economy.
Absolutely, yeah, and who knows what's coming, and but And when you look historically at immigration enforcement in the United States, I mean, that's been the pattern. And there's been this pendulum swing of, periods of increasing attacks against immigrants, and at its core, there's always an economic reason behind that.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks for listening.